Scott. Thank you, Scott. Welcome, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I look forward to this at the end of my Wednesdays. Yeah, so the topics I choose always kind of just come out from what's been in my atmosphere the last couple of days, and been doing a lot of work with clients in the unit in LA, and themes always come up. But one thing that seems to have come up lately with some repetition is the whole idea of honesty. And when we talk about honesty, what does that mean? And why do addicts kind of have a problem with honesty and all that? So I thought we'd start talking about that a little bit. I'd like to just sort of lay out some of the dangers of lying, which is really what we're talking about. And then I want to talk about sort of the advantages of honesty as far as recovery goes. So why do people lie? You know, especially why do addicts lie? And there's several reasons that we see typically. One, addicts lie to protect themselves, right? We have things to hide. We've compartmentalized aspects of our lives. We have things we're ashamed of. We're doing behaviors that people that love us would be upset about. And so we cover. But in my experience, addicts have been lying long before they were addicts. I think sometimes we lie to protect ourselves in kind of dangerous, emotionally dangerous situations as kids and adverse circumstances. We lie to cover. And for many addicts, you'll hear them say lying is just kind of second nature. And we've even talked about that in this webinar. Both Scott and I have talked about how in early recovery, we would say stuff. It's like, why did I say that? I don't even have to say that. But it just, I've read literature actually that says it takes several hundred times of correcting yourself to kind of correct that habit. So it is really just a matter of correcting. That's why we'll get to this in a moment, but why we recommend people come clean about their life. They tell a lie, correct it, and correct it as soon as you can. That's because we understand it probably is going to happen. Why else do addicts lie? They lie to protect themselves from the consequences of what they've done. If you don't find out about it, then it didn't happen. But of course, that's not exactly how it works out. But I think sometimes we do try to cover, and you'll hear many addicts say how overwhelming it is trying to remember who knows what and what story was told to whom, and just trying to keep all that straight requires a tremendous amount of energy. Which brings me to my third point, is that lying becomes a habit. People do it just out of habit. I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, people lie with when they don't have to. It just kind of comes out automatically. They might exaggerate. You know, I think the example came up recently where somebody said, well, I got a 93 on a test, but I said I had a 97. You know, why? 4 points, but it wasn't good enough to have a 93. So it goes back to old beliefs about ourselves being worthy, being good enough, and so on, sometimes being perfectionistic. Addicts tend to lie without even realizing, as I said. There's a lot of self-delusion that goes with it. A lot of denial, we've always talked about, is a key component of addiction. And a lot of lying takes place in that context. And people not only lie, addicts not only lie to other people, they lie to themselves. In fact, they probably lie to themselves more than anything. And that's why it gets so confusing. It's like, what is up and what is down? And sometimes the gaslighting can kind of do a kind of backfire into the face of the addict, where it just gets all confused, and we can sort of fall into denial. The other thing you'll sometimes hear addicts saying is they lie to protect other people. You know, and I can maybe make that case if we're talking about a young child and Santa Claus, maybe. But I think when we're talking about behaviors that can really impact the safety, both the physical safety or an emotional safety of people we love, then I think that becomes a stretch. So why shouldn't we lie? Lying is a real relapse trigger. You know, honesty is required for recovery. And if we can't be rigorously honest, we either will relapse or have a trigger to relapse, or we get stuck. And I think when I see people getting stuck in their recovery, not feeling like they're making progress, I always kind of go backtrack a little bit and start to look at honesty. It's like, okay, what part of your story are you kind of telling yourself that may not be totally accurate? Because I think oftentimes when people do get kind of mired at a point in recovery, it's about them being unwilling perhaps to face something that they've held on to that they just don't want to face. And I think most addicts, we see that in treatment all the time. People come in, it's like, well, I'm going to hang on to this one to my grave because nobody could ever find out about this because of shame or disappointment or fear. And it's, of course, healthier to let that stuff go and release it and kind of put it into the light. But a lot of times we make those statements with ourselves, well, I'll be honest about this and this, but that is so terrible, I'm never going to tell you about that. And if we get in that kind of situation, we've really compromised our recovery. So that's where I think the phrase, that's my understanding of the phrase rigorous honesty, really sort of looking at stuff. And that's, and the steps kind of gently guide us through this. But many people, when they hit that fourth step, that fearless moral inventory, really get hung up. And that stalled me for a while too, because I just wasn't ready to face some of that stuff and really look at it. So I think that's a really important piece. But it is important that the 12 steps require that rigorous honesty, and that if we don't, once you start living that way, when you do tell a lie, it feels very wrong. There's a lot of guilt, and I think it's something that's an urge we want to kind of self-correct it. The other thing, as I mentioned, that self-deception can be so overwhelming if we're not rigorously honest with ourselves. But then more importantly, what does honesty do? You know, if we can start to be rigorously honest, honesty really allows, that honesty is really the gateway for healing. And I think once we can become honest with ourselves, only then can we start to really make progress in terms of healing ourselves. Only when we're honest can our families, can our husbands or wives or partners look at us and start to develop some trust and start to heal there as well. So honesty is really pivotal for the healing process all around. You know, I've had clients that done psychotherapy for 30 years. Some clients come in and they just aren't honest. And eventually we have to have a talk like, why are you wasting your money and my time telling me this story? You know, it's why? To impress me? I'm not impressed. You know, so it's that and sometimes we see people coming to treatment as well. It's kind of, they're holding out in certain parts of their lives. And it just really is doing a disservice to them and really wasting everybody's time and their money. Also, finally, I think when we develop an ability to be honest, it's a habit that can get stronger. It's like going to the gym and building up a muscle. I think we come into recovery with this impulse to kind of be dishonest and not be truthful about stuff out of fear, out of protection, out of shame. But when we really embrace recovery, it's all about becoming rigorously honest. And that is just vital. I have found it's useful to keep a journal for that honesty piece, to be track of behavior, to reduce the risk of getting caught up in self-delusion. And I think sometimes we forget key moments and sometimes very key things. So I think it's just a good habit to write things down and keep a journal. I think that's, I'll just finish up with that. I think just the idea that honesty is not something to be taken kind of half-heartedly. It's really the core of the recovery process. And without it, and I would say without willingness there too, the willingness to be honest, it's going to fall flat. And it's a real relapse risk if we can't start to become rigorously honest. As I said, you know, progress, not perfection. People are going to slip up. And what we say is that the importance is that you get back on track right away, clear it up. Because of that, by the way, and I know Scott feels the same way, we do not typically recommend putting lying or dishonesty in the inner circle, meaning a relapse. We put it in that middle circle, indicating kind of slippery slope. If you're lying, that's a risk to your sobriety. And if you do, you need to correct it as soon as possible. I think so with that, I will stop and we can carry on.
And hey, you guys at the treatment center, we just talked about circle plans. I forgot to mention you all need to put lying and keeping secrets in your middle circle. So yeah, thank you, David, for reminding us of that. And I just used the word secrets. How do you equate secrets and lies? Are they the same thing? Are they different? Are they variations? I mean, where are we with that?
Yeah, I think in effect, they're the same thing because we can have lying by omission as well, right? I think sometimes people think, well, if I just don't say that part, it's okay. And I define a lie as, you know, lie of commission and lie of omission. Leaving something out is a lie. And in effect, secrets are the same thing. I think where they're different is that secrets may be more rooted in shame. And some of that, we sometimes may tell ourselves we're protecting somebody from the truth, all that rationalization. But I think basically secrets function as lies, and they're connected to the same kind of process. And they certainly have the same effect of slowing down the recovery process. That really just helps it stall out. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and you know, the big lie that we see with addicts and other people who engage in infidelity is, you know, what my partner doesn't know about can't hurt my partner or my relationship. And that's a tremendous lie on a bunch of levels. Can you talk about that, David? I mean, just because you don't know that I'm cheating, can I still be hurting you and my relationship?
Yeah, I mean, and the answer is of course, right? Because first of all, you know, part of our treatment process to have partners, wives, husbands read letters, impact letters, and in almost every case, the partners know quite a bit, if not everything. And so I think even if we don't say it, people know, or at least they know something's wrong. You know, when we're active in our addiction, we're disconnected, we're vacant, we're emotionally, you know, not present, and people feel that. And so I think when we pretend or tell ourselves or fool ourselves by saying that, well, if they don't know, it's not going to hurt them, you know, they're going to find out anyway, and they probably know something is wrong, and absolutely it's hurtful. And it's hurting us as well. We're kind of in this delusional state where, well, you know, if they don't know, it's going to be okay. And that's wrong all around. So yeah, I think definitely it's a mistaken strategy to adopt that posture, because absolutely it's painful and hurtful.
Yeah, betrayed partners almost always know something is off, even if they don't know what. And by the way, your kids know something is off too,
Right.
even if they don't know what, and they will internalize and blame themselves.
Right. That's what kids do. That's how they're wired. Yep.
And they'll develop shame around it, and they'll carry that with them throughout their lives.
You know, which just gives me an opportunity to real quickly talk about a little side issue here, but that's this intergenerational pattern of addiction, right? We can, unless it's interrupted, we will pass it on to our kids. Just that dysfunction, with the shame, the secrecy, just like it was passed on to us. And I always tell our clients, this is a chance to interrupt that pattern that's gone on probably for generations in your family, and to really do something different. And even if the kids are older, they can really still benefit from witnessing a parent get into honest recovery. It makes a huge difference, and it's healing for the whole family.
Yeah, yeah. Pop your questions into the Q&A feature about honesty, about telling the truth, rigorous honesty, tell the truth, tell it faster, however you want to do it, or any other aspect of addiction and recovery. And we'll get to those in just a second. But David, you mentioned lying becomes a habit, especially for addicts, and I am certainly example number one. And that it takes several hundred self-corrections to break the habit. And again, perfect example of that. In the interim, we have betrayed partners who desperately need the truth. They're waiting on disclosure. They're waiting on full disclosure and honesty, and they really need to know what's going on, and they really need their betraying partner to tell the truth. But it's this habit to lie. So, you know, there's a push-pull, and what boundaries can couples set around lying and coming clean to help break this habit without letting the lies, as they sneak out, damage the relationship any further?
Right. And you've really laid out one of the really painful kind of problems, especially in early recovery, because the partners are seeking that emotional safety that comes with honesty and knowing everything. And very often they've suffered this kind of drip of disclosure that is extremely painful. And then they project and think, well, what else is there? And so if they can't expect total honesty, I think it's a concern. So understanding that it's a habit that's got to be broken, and it's not a switch we can turn. I think the best boundary we can have is to come clean, and come clean as soon as possible. And I think the boundary that we often suggest is within 24 hours to tell the spouse to really come clean with that, and hopefully sooner, but no more than that. And I think that's a way, that's kind of a self-correcting mechanism. And so at least the spouse can ideally be assured that they'll at least have the truth within 24 hours if somebody does tell a lie. But I think what I've seen is that what's really, if somebody has embraced recovery, the kind of lying we're talking about tends to be small stuff and not the big deal stuff. It's kind of the stupid stuff that shouldn't be lied about anyway. You know, I think we had an example here once, like, did I take out the garbage? And well, yeah, I did, but I really didn't. And I said to run and do it. That's a lie technically, but it's not kind of that emotionally stab in the heart kind of lie that we see with addiction commonly.
Yeah. I see one of the participants has raised a hand. We don't do that in webinars, but if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A feature and we'll be happy to answer it for you. And I just want to mention, you mentioned the steps 4 and 5. 4 is taking a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5 is sharing it with another person. So getting really honest with another person. And then as we work up to the step 9, where we make amends. And then step 10 is sort of all those steps rolled into one. And when we get to step 10, by the time we get to step 10, the road has really narrowed. You mentioned earlier that lies start to feel wrong. And I remember when that happened to me, I would hear a lie come out of my mouth because I hadn't quite broken the habit. And I would just be like, oh, you know, it would make my skin crawl. I would cringe, you know, and I used to just be able to lie with reckless abandon. And it just kind of, you know, if I tell a lie now, boy, it drives me crazy until I come clean with it, because the road has really narrowed. You know, people will talk about, you know, oh, I used to eat grapes in the grocery store and, you know, out of the cart before I got, you know, and somewhere in recovery, that becomes no longer an acceptable behavior because you're stealing grapes. You know, it's 7 cents, but it, you know, the road gets narrower, but it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Right. There's a kind of a, I can only, the word that comes is a clean feeling of kind of living in integrity and honestly, right? And you're right, Scott, when you're not, you feel it, and it just doesn't, it feels icky and wrong. And I think that's just comes with time and practice and rigorous honesty. And I think the expectation of rigorous honesty, you know, that's, even if we are saying addicts are probably going to lie until they can break that habit, I think the expectation is still rigorous honesty. That's the ideal that we set. And if people can meet that perfectly or not, probably not, but I think that's still what we need to expect.
So, okay. Pop your questions into the Q&A feature. We'll get to as many of them as we can, get them in early, and your chance of getting it answered are much better. So the first one we've got here, can you talk about the role of psychedelics in sex addiction compared to other classes of drugs, if any? What are your thoughts on their recreational and medicinal use? What are the associated risks for a sex addict? Is there any literature that can help us understand this?
Great topic. So we are in the middle of kind of a little bit of a renaissance with looking at some of these drugs in terms of their potential therapeutic role. But in terms of psychedelics and sex addiction, psychedelics are generally not considered an addictive kind of drug, in that the experience is so intense and sometimes unique that it's not the kind of thing that discharges dopamine. In fact, it doesn't discharge dopamine in any way, except for a little bit of ecstasy, but that's not really a psychedelic. But it's in that kind of in the group of drugs that are used in a similar manner. But the experience is really so unique and intense that it's generally not considered something that people get addicted to. They may do repeated, you know, LSD trips just out of the experience, but we don't necessarily classify that as an addiction. So that's just the nature of the experience, the way they work mostly in the frontal cortex, the neocortex, as opposed to the midbrain or the limbic system. It's like a whole different chemical effect in the brain. So basically, we don't see many people coming in for addiction to that. In terms of sex addiction, I have had some people use some LSD. It's usually, though, it's such an internal experience. It's really not often expressed in sexual terms. You just don't see that very much. In terms of medicinal use, we are really discovering now more and more what people have suspected for a long time, the potential therapeutic benefit of ecstasy, MDMA, for trauma, because it helps people basically approach some of those memories in a less guarded way, and you can do more therapeutic work with that. It's moving very fast. There is now certification in the state of California to deal with psychedelics in therapy. And so it's there. I'm not quite there myself yet, but I'm interested in the research. That's what's going on. And it shows great potential and great promise. I think, for the sex addict, I think any use of chemicals, mood altering or not, is a dangerous kind of thing. And I'd be very leery of that, of mixing any drug, including psychedelics for a sex addict. In terms of the literature, I can't point to any one thing. There's a whole bunch of research out there now, research articles that are coming out almost daily about this stuff. So I would check just that. If you just Google that, probably you could find some really interesting literature. And I'd look for something from, university or a governmental agency, NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, for example, something that is reputable, because there's a whole bunch of other kinds of sites that I don't quite trust that talk about this stuff. But it's a very exciting area of research. So I'm really curious to see what happens in the next couple of years. It's great. It shows great promise.
Yeah, I just want to add that although there is some promise, these are highly controlled settings. There are people out there who offer workshops where everybody does peyote and you're supposed to open your, and I just know so many people who've had horrendous experiences, bad trips, really messed them, if you're ever going to try this, please do it in a super controlled setting with somebody who 100% knows what they're doing. I am not a fan. There's going to have to be a lot of literature. I'll probably need more literature to convince me than David does. And I think David needs a whole bunch of literature to convince him that this is the way to go.
Yeah.
And when I get questions like this, I always think you're just asking for permission to drop acid, and I'm not going to give it to you.
Yeah. There are, drugs out there. Ayahuasca, for one, is offered as a remedy for drug addiction. I've had my horror story, a client, methamphetamine client, who was desperate for a solution, went to Costa Rica to an ayahuasca weekend and totally freaked out and stole a Jeep and jumped out of the moving Jeep in the jungle and hit his head and had a head injury and just really bad stuff. So there's also in the Bahamas, they use some African roots. There's treatment centers. Be very leery. It's not legal, and it's not legal for a good reason here. It's just not safe. So yeah.
So next question. My wife has some past sexual trauma, and she is in the state of this sex addiction is your problem, not mine. I want to help her, but I understand that I can only work on me, but I want to support her in a healthy way. What would you suggest? Next question.
Yeah. So this sounds strange, but I think probably the best thing you can do for her is to really work on yourself right now. If she has sex addiction, sexual trauma, not sex addiction, sorry, sexual trauma, that's probably about as much as she can handle right that. And it's probably a lot triggered by your own addiction. So I think she's kind of giving you a clear message saying it's your problem, just she can't deal with that. And I would suggest that you do that as well. You deal with you. And I would try to make sure she gets the support and help she needs from a qualified professional who could help her with that sexual trauma. I assume she is getting some sort of support. Basically, I think over time that there's no reason why you guys can't mutually support each other. But I think right now, the healing process is going to be on kind of individual tracks for each of you, because you each need to do that healing. And I think right now, if there's too much interference from one to the other, it's going to really set one or both of you back a little bit. So I would kind of honor that ability to do two independent healing tracks, and then down the road, maybe do some couples work or work to repair the relationship. But I would really honor her request to keep it separate for now.
And correct me if I'm wrong, David, but number one, it's not uncommon for sex addicts to find people who've had sexual trauma and hook up and get married, but that's not my point here. My point is, she's got some sexual trauma in the past, and your behavior as an addict has really exacerbated the trauma symptoms and the feelings of trauma, and probably brought up some PTSD.
Right.
She probably doesn't want much support from you right now, because you're part of the trauma that she's trying to work through. And even though that trauma, you're not the cause of it, you're not the perpetrator, your addiction, it just gets linked to it. And she's going to have to do some healing before she's going to be able to let you in.
Right. Because any kind of active addiction around someone who's had sexual trauma, it brings it up, it aggravates it, and kind of inflames it, if you will. And yeah, you need just some space there to help each person do their healing.
Do you have any tips on journal writing? Besides being honest, do we, in free form, be explicit in our writing, even if someone else is able to find the journal? Do we have to rewrite things in a positive fashion if the first draft is negative? Also, do you recommend revisiting your writing after a few months or years?
Great question. So journal writing, I think, is really important for a couple of reasons. One, when we write, and by the way, when I say journal writing, I'm talking about writing with your hand, not using a computer. When we write with our hands, and especially this is a great exercise, if we write with our non-dominant hand, different things come out. It's a different process than if we're just verbalizing. And so there's a different neurological kind of process for putting things into writing through our hands. And sometimes, very, very often, in fact, when you write stuff, you will find that there's some discoveries to be made in the things that you write. You may write things that surprise you, or you hadn't thought about, or just it starts to flow. And it's almost like another person kind of channeling your past. And so I think it's a great process. Sometimes if we are doing a therapeutic assignment, like to write a letter to your younger self, or to abusive parent who's deceased or something like that, we might ask them to do that in their non-dominant hand, which even more is kind of liberated from the sensors in the brain that are kind of keeping certain things from coming out. It lets it flow in a very uninterrupted way. So, and in a way that, by the way, if you're typing a journal or typing your assignments, it's not the same effect. And so I believe in freehand writing, journal writing. I think there is a risk always of people finding something. I believe in just being really honest in journals. Otherwise, what's the point? If you're editing or kind of writing as if somebody else is going to read it, to me, that you're not getting the full benefit of a journal. Because what happens in a healing process, in any healing process, we have awakenings, we have discoveries, we have key moments, and we forget a lot. I mean, very often we'll have something, and if we don't write it down, it kind of slips into that mist of memory. And so I think journaling is a beautiful way to kind of not only log discoveries, log things about yourself, but you can go back and look. And so when you mentioned going back, I absolutely recommend going back and looking at patterns, seeing where you were. Sometimes it'll make you feel great if you see progress. Sometimes you see, my God, I dealt with the same thing before. Sometimes you'll find, oh, I had an answer for this before that I didn't realize. So it's very useful to kind of just log these things. Otherwise, if we just kind of go through this discovery process of growth, if we're not logging it somewhere, writing it down, it'll get lost. And I fear that we'll repeat it and just kind of not make progress and start spinning. So journaling is a really important piece. I think if you write something in a negative fashion, then there's something to be said for that. I think it could be a really good exercise. My own journal years ago, when I was kind of trying to reverse that built-in negativity that a lot of addicts have, a lot of stuff I write would be negative, and I would go back and take note of that and try to kind of rewrite certain things in a positive sense, just to have the practice of converting but I don't think, I don't believe in editing your journal too much, if at all. Scott, what do you think as a writer?
Here we are talking about honesty, and if you can't be honest in your journal,
Yeah.
where can you be honest? I mean, you're addicts. We're great at lying to ourselves. We're great at keeping secrets from ourselves, and the whole purpose of journaling is to get this stuff out. Even the stuff that we really push down tends to come out in the journal, and I love writing with the offhand. And these things work. They work. My thought here is betrayed partners, please stay out of the addict's journal. Addicts, please stay out of the betrayed partner's journal. Journals are private, period. I don't care if you're in a relationship. I don't care if there's been betrayal. Journals are private, and they are a place where we work on honesty and we work on healing, and they're not pretty. And if you're a betrayed partner and you're digging in the addict's journal or homework, you are just going to re-traumatize yourself. Don't.
Yeah. That's betrayal in itself. Yeah.
And vice versa for addicts. I mean, here you are, you're worried that your partner's going to leave you or this or that, and you're just going to go in there and traumatize yourself, because this is where your betrayed partner gets to be honest about really hating you sometimes. These are, we put it in our journal because it's not appropriate to share yet with our loved ones, or even in therapy sometimes. We work through what is the truth, what is not the truth. So yeah, please respect your partner's journal and homeworks if they're doing them. It's counterproductive not to. Okay, I'm done ranting. I put in something in the chat feature. Harriet Hunter did a great webinar, a one-off webinar for us. So I put the link in there. It's about journaling. She's
great.
And I think you addressed rewriting things in a positive fashion if your first draft is negative, but I didn't hear it. Could you repeat it if you did address? Because I want to know.
Yeah, I mean, this is just for me personally. I think whatever kind of falls out onto the paper is what it needs to be on the paper, right? I don't try to edit it, or like I would writing an essay or something. It's not about constructing and composing. It's about kind of really getting what's in my head out onto an external memory device. And so I may find stuff. The only time I've ever rewritten stuff, I was mentioning early on, if things were particularly negative, because I had a real strong negativity bias and the whole world sucked and I was awful and everybody else was awful and all that. And I sort of would go back and as an exercise in trying to correct my thinking, I would go back and see, okay, well, this is a really negative statement. How might I be able to rework that? And so it's kind of just an exercise in converting stuff. Once frankly, I realized how negative I was by reading my journal and what was coming out. I had no idea. I thought I was just kind of happy-go-lucky. I was like this, suicidal, depressive person who, we've talked before about the people I thought were funny, were these really nasty, sarcastic people. So the journal really helped me see that. And it provided a way to kind of start to figure out, well, how can I correct this? So that's the only time I've ever edited.
I had the same experience going back and reading some of my early journals. Oh my God, what a mess.
Yeah.
People actually still talk to me, but of course it was the worst of me pouring out onto the page, not the best of me at that time. But I also did the exercise of rewriting a few things, not eliminating what was in the journal, just trying to reframe that situation so that
exactly
feeling negative and seeing negative in the future, I would have some practice at sort of reframing in a more positive way. And I do think that's highly useful. As a betrayed spouse, 2 years, 7 months past discovery, how do I deal with a husband who goes to meetings, has a CSAT, which is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist, has a sponsor, has sponsees, etc., but still continues to manipulate, gaslight, and lie, not only to me, but to his CSAT, in our marital therapy sessions, etc. by minimizing his out of control behaviors during arguments, including physical fights, saying I didn't even yell at her, etc. He admitted about a month ago that his suicidality during our discussions and arguments was a way to manipulate me.
Sorry, I was muted for a sec. Yeah, so we have somebody, I guess I'd call this going through the motions. Based on what we're reading, CSAT, a sponsor, sponsees, which is worrisome. But that, and no matter how many accoutrements somebody has in their life in terms of their recovery, if they're not walking the walk and if their behavior isn't showing it, then I have real concern, right? And so if we're still seeing gaslighting and manipulating and blaming with, suicidality and manipulating, those are all really worrisome signs to me. And so I think there's a real issue here that, to me, I don't really care that there's all these CSATs and sponsors and stuff. If we're not seeing the behavior, something's really wrong. And so I think this is an area of great concern, frankly, that something's not working. And we were talking tonight about rigorous honesty. And I think there's a problem with honesty here. Just the behaviors just don't add up to everything else. So yeah, and this is sad to hear after 2 years and 7 months, this has been going on. But I think this is a real problem. Scott, any thoughts on this one?
I'm wondering if you'll comment on using suicidality, fake suicidality, we're going to assume here, as a way to manipulate someone during an argument.
Yeah, so really I as somebody who has worked in a therapy setting with people who are the survivors of someone who committed suicide, it's incredibly traumatic, incredibly painful, and to threaten that. And I agree with Scott. I think it sounds like a manipulative thing. This person sounds maybe too narcissistic to really be suicidal. But that's a cruel, cruel thing to do. And that's an extremely cruel thing to do. And that's probably the most worrisome thing of all in here, that kind of level of manipulation, emotional manipulation would take place. So I think there's a lot of red flags going on here.
Can you tell us more about how to work on focus? What is the most effective way to improve focus so I'm not distracted by someone else or food or whatever it is outside of myself? I do go, this is from Upper Trade Partner, I believe. I do go to Al-Anon to work on this. However, is bio-neurofeedback more effective than meditation to improve focus, or is there an even more effective way to improve this? I also notice I'm more focused when I'm calm. Just curious about this. Thanks for your service.
Yeah, there's some great points in there. And our ability to focus really starts to fray when we get stressed and when we start to worry about too many things and have some emotional ups and downs. It's really difficult to focus because what's happening is you're being pulled off center and spending energy to refocus on the subject and pulled off center again. It's very distracting, very unsatisfying, and very distressing sometimes. I think the best thing I can recommend for focus is close to meditation, but I would say mindfulness, because mindfulness is this ability to just observe and practice being centered and in the here and now without judgment. It's noticing things. Inside you, outside you, just being aware. And there's been a lot of studies, if we can practice mindfulness in a fairly regular basis, and I'm not saying that we have to be gurus kind of walking around in this enlightened state all the time, but just really make a habit of trying to be mindful at certain times, that at least mindfulness walks or so on, that has been shown to actually start to kind of reorganize the brain in a way that does help focus. So I think mindfulness is great. Meditation certainly can't hurt. Meditation also, there's been a lot of work that shows how the brain kind of reorganizes itself with someone who consistently meditates. So to me, and you've observed that you have more focus when you're calm. I think if we can sort of be with our thoughts, observe them, and not be in a reactive state to them, again, which is You have to be kind of an enlightened being sometimes to do that, because we all get caught up in our lives. But if you can sort of observe and not get really too caught up in it, I think that really goes a long way toward helping you focus. And by the way, we're talking about lying and being a habitual kind of thing. Being kind of scattered is also a habit. And I think we can practice focusing, and we can strengthen that ability by just practice. And so if you can increase the amount of time and do little increments, so maybe it's okay, I can say focus for a minute or 5 minutes or whatever. And by the way, as human beings, we're going to get distracted. That's nobody can do it perfectly for too long. But I think you can really, with some practice, extend your ability to stay focused. But again, if your mind is racing, if you're emotionally upset, or you're having mood swings, or you have a huge worry about your addict partner, or something that's really difficult circumstance. Anybody that's tried to work when they have some crisis going on, it's really hard to focus. So that's really an adverse circumstance for focusing. But I do think even in the worst of circumstances, with some practice, we can get better, we can improve and stay focused. And for me, mindfulness is kind of the doorway to that.
Yeah, and we talk about mindfulness all the time. There's 100 different ways to go about it. I had a friend in recovery who used to just look at me and go, "Where are your feet?" He could tell when I was distracted, and I would look down and, "Oh, I'm here. I'm doing this. I'm here for this purpose." David talks about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things I see, 4 things I touch, 3 things I hear, 2 things I smell, 1 thing I taste, or just work through your senses. I find gratitude lists to be a form of mindfulness. I have to think about my life and my place in the world and what I'm grateful for. To me, that's a form of mindfulness. And also just focus exercises. I don't think you mentioned this, David, but there are things, neural exercises, doing the Sudoku, or doing not a difficult crossword, but an easy crossword, but just doing it every day kind of trains the brain to focus a little bit. I mean, they do this with people who've had traumatic brain injury and things. They give them little puzzles to improve the brain focus. So I don't know if that would improve an addict's focus or betrayed partner's focus, but I would think it would.
Oh, for sure. I will say one thing, there's a really high co-occurring rate of ADHD with sex addicts, it's like up to 30% sometimes. And so the addict may be also having a chemical, and the partner too, for that matter. I don't know the statistics on co-occurring ADHD and partners, but if you have something like that going on, it's really hard to focus because your brain is kind of jumping around. But even in those cases, there's medication, of course, but these practices we're talking about, mindfulness and meditation, can really be helpful. I should say, you mentioned bioneurofeedback, which is a really interesting and very valid technique, right? Because that allows us to really start to connect with our bodies. And I think that also can be very useful. I think, and I don't know the research on this, but my guess is that probably mindfulness and meditation are probably more effective than feedback for this particular issue, but I'm sure it can't hurt.
David, this next question specifically asks about CBT, but I think let's make it more general. CBT, DBT, any form of therapy. Are there any CBT tools for self-therapy at home? How effective compared to working with a therapist, which might be expensive? Might see some therapy manuals on Amazon, but I'm not sure how much they will help. Can we give ourselves therapy?
Yeah, I think we can go a long way. We can help ourselves. We can study. There are, Scott mentioned DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, which actually I think is very useful for that kind of home study, because it's skills to apply, decision making, and mood regulation and focus exercise, that kind of thing. So it's very, very skill based. And it's very present tense, right? In therapy, what are we doing? We're kind of putting together the larger patterns. We're maybe going into the past a little bit. We're trying to put together a very complicated story. And I think it's really, I won't say impossible, but I think it's pretty difficult for somebody to do that on their own without kind of a guide, because we're talking tonight about dishonesty and lying. And sometimes even if we're not intentionally doing it, we sometimes are kind of dishonest with ourselves about certain things, or we're blind to certain things that we just can't see until somebody else points it out in us. So I think that therapeutic process is really important. However, I think there are some things like skill manuals. There's, for example, a really excellent anxiety workbook by a guy named Bourne that is very useful for exercises. So I think as an adjunct to therapy, or if your situation isn't as so serious that you might need therapy, to maybe try it with these at home. But I think they really can't replace the person-to-person basis of therapy, although there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can use to help the situation. But I think just based on the nature of our minds, our human minds, it's really hard to do it by yourself, because we just need that outside person reflecting things back for us sometimes.
Yeah, and David, I was just about to ask a question, but I see it's been typed in here as a follow-up question. So would you recommend taking therapy sessions at universities from grad students who might be working under the supervision of professional therapists? Less expensive, but are there risks with that?
Right. So, every licensed therapist has to have, thousands of hours of supervision while they're training before they can get licensed and practice as an independent practitioner. And so there are benefits in terms of cost, for sure, for that. And it's kind of the luck of the draw. I think I'm thinking of a social service agency here where I live that works with the LGBTQ community. And their whole model is supervising grad students because it's affordable for people. But the problem is this particular agency gets clients that are really complex with drug issues and other kinds of addiction issues and mental health problems. And the more complex the client, I think the less effective a new therapist or a training therapist can be. So if you have a good supervisor, that goes a long way to help. But I think if it's a relatively straightforward problem, I think that kind of setting where you're working with students can be useful. But I think, boy, quickly our cases get really complex. And I think there's a real advantage in working with somebody who's kind of seen everything and has some, what we call seasoned approaches to things, where they kind of have seen stuff before and have a knowledge of it. I just had a medical procedure yesterday. I don't want to be, the first one somebody's ever done out of school. I want to have somebody that's done a lot of them. So I think the same thing is true with therapy. And of course they're supervised, but I can tell you from, I'm a supervisor, qualified supervisor, and I'm on top of things, but I know a whole bunch of supervisors who they sign it and they're not there. So there's some risk in that process. Let me just put it that way.
And by the way, some therapists are just naturally better than others, depending on the client sometimes. But so, you always, wherever you look for therapy, look for a good fit for you. If it doesn't feel like the right therapist, it probably isn't. But I think with social service agencies and universities, you don't have a lot of choice. You get who you get. Right.
And I will say, there are people that seek out, people with reputations that have, a good reputation. And even those people aren't meant for everybody. It still has to be a fit. I'd really go with your gut and seeing if this is somebody you can work with. This is somebody you're going to have to really trust. It's going to be a very intimate relationship. And if there's some doubt about that, it's perfectly okay to ask a therapist about their approach and what they do, and to kind of check that out. In my opinion, I think that makes for a better relationship ultimately than just going because somebody has a great name or somebody has a great reputation. They may not be the right fit for you, as Scott said.
I love this next question. What is the difference between individual therapy and group therapy? Is one more effective than the other, or are they used based on the type of mental health issue involved? Great question.
Right. So, as it sounds, individual therapy is really one-to-one therapy. It's me working for usually an hour at a time with somebody across from me, and it may be talk, it may be some kind of trauma work with experiential trauma therapies, it may be I do hypnosis sometimes, so there's different kinds of approaches. Group therapy is a group, obviously, as it sounds, facilitated by a therapist or two. What I believe for addiction, basically group is the magic sauce. I mean, group is where it's at. Individual is important, especially for trauma work sometimes, but it's the group that really has the power. And I think the wisdom. And I just think groups, when they're run properly and when they're set up where people feel safe and contained and can really start to work, it's the group that really just has amazing power. I can say something to a client and they might take it in, but if their peer tells them that, I think it really goes in directly. And when the group works like that, it's really beautiful. We have some great groups of Seeking Integrity, by the way, like the guys this week have been doing amazing work as they often do, because they're really there for each other and at different stages. And the problem with any addict or really any human being, I guess, is we have blind spots and sometimes we don't see stuff and we don't see how we really are coming across. And to have somebody who has no agenda except to be honest with you, give you feedback about what they're seeing or experiencing or feeling from you is incredibly valuable. And those are the relationships, by the way. We talk about creating intimacy. A lot of sex addicts we say have an intimacy disorder. How do we heal that? How do we learn intimacy? Well, we learn it in group. We learn it because what are we doing? We're still learning to trust people. We're learning to be vulnerable. We're learning to accept feedback. We're learning all these critical relationship skills to develop intimacy that are directly transferable once you get home to your marriages, your family, your friends. So it's an incredibly powerful format. And I think both are useful, right? Both are useful. But I think for addictions, it's really beneficial to have a group included or process. I always recommend my clients, once they go home, if they leave Seeking Integrity, to have both, and this always sounds pretty therapy top heavy, but I think it's really the best recommendation I can make is individual therapy and a men's group, a group of men run by a therapist, in addition to 12-step groups. But a therapy group, obviously, 12-step is not therapy. To have a 12-step group is really like the Cadillac plan for recovery. These people make the best progress.
Yeah, and there's research that shows the best outcomes from in addiction recovery are a combination of individual therapy, group therapy, 12-step work, and they didn't study other social support, but we offer on our drop-in groups and webinars and things. But it seems like kind of the more the better, but the group settings seem to really stick in a way. And I'm the same as David. My therapist could tell me something, but I was much more likely to hear it from someone in my group who was struggling with the same things as me as I was to hear it from my therapist. And I don't know why. I mean, I was paying the therapist, but not the other person in the group. But
right.
That's kind of just a truth of addicts. I've tried to regularly meditate in the past, and I understand that it is important throughout the recovery process. How can I get better at beginning to meditate? Are there specific aspects of meditation that are more beneficial to recovery than others?
Great question. I like to kind of demystify meditation. I think people get really hung up on technique and all that, and I've gone through some pretty intense training from some Hindu classes with different eye rolls and tongue to the top of the roof, the mouth, and all that. It can get very complicated. But I think really, if you're trying to learn this, meditation is all about just quieting the mind. And I think so many people worry that their mind is jumpy. Well, it is jumpy. That's kind of the point. And what I found, those things kind of burn off after a while. If I can stick with it, usually within 5 or 10 minutes, my mind calms down, but all the kind of craziness has to, I call it burning off. It just kind of, I have to go through it. And what we do is we gently bring ourselves back. Yeah, I think about, the laundry that I forgot in the washing machine. Okay, bring myself back. And I think about, I'm hungry, bring myself back, and just over and over again. And eventually you quiet. And for me, meditation is about listening. It's about I combine it with prayer, but putting out a prayer, but then listening quietly for an internal voice and external thoughts, whatever, but things come to me. We were talking about focus earlier. It's a focused awareness is what it is. And I think don't get too hung up on the technique, especially if you're beginning. and do it for, give yourself 5 minutes, set a timer. Don't try to do an hour because you're going to get very frustrated. Just build up slowly. It's a skill, and it does happen fast once you get it in the groove of it. But start slow and start small, and just be gentle with yourself. Bring yourself back to focus, because you're going to get pushed off numerous times. Just get back up and focus again.
And I would add, since we just talked about the power of group therapy, I am much better with a guided meditation or especially a guided group meditation. I don't know why. It just works better for me.
Yeah, those are fabulous too. They're just fun.
I mean, and it doesn't matter how it's constructed or put together. It works for me in a way that meditating by myself does not. So I love this question too. Have you ever seen a long distance relationship successfully work out for a sex addict, or anyone for that matter? Long distance relationships, but particularly for addicts.
Yeah, so they're tough, right? And I think part of the appeal, and for a sex addict, and especially for a love and romance addict, long distance relationships have a great appeal because the person is not accessible, right? And so you get this like frenzied communication for a month or something till you can see each other, you come together, it's wild and wonderful.
You can stamp a fantasy on them.
No, exactly. And kind of make up all the difference, because you're not dealing with, their dirty socks on the floor, the dishes left in the sink or whatever. It's all kind of a romantic notion. I've had a couple clients over the years who worked really hard to finally get together on the same coast. And after 2 or 3 years of a successful long distance relationship, and within a couple of months of living together, it all fell apart, because part of the appeal was the distance and the inaccessibility and the romantic idea of what it was like and who they were, and it didn't hold up to reality. So I think long distance relationships are tricky, for sure.
They're easier than they used to be because you can Zoom and you can actually really genuinely get to know somebody. But again, until you're living in the same house, you don't know what their hygiene habits really are. And, if they leave dishes in the sink overnight, I mean, you can see my kitchen, but you don't know if there's dishes in my sink there or not, by the way. When dirty, reality sets in.
Let's see, Scott. I want to see.
In the same house.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you, everybody. Great questions. Great topic, David. Honesty always sparks a great discussion. Be well, everyone. David will be back next week, but he'll be here with Tammy, not me. In 2 weeks, I'll be back in the saddle.
Great.
Be well. Stay sober. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just honesty has got all work at it. All of us. It's the way out. Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Scott. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.